It's SDL, finally. We were running late today because of weird technical problems. We all know about that, right? Hey, listen, finally, after all this time, the year has started. We're halfway through January. We're going to start talking about Spectre and Meltdown. Now, to do that, we have to talk about a lot of other stuff first so that you understand what we're talking about. So stick around when we talk about memory, buffer overflows, and all this kind of weird stuff that you hear about, but maybe you'd like to know how it works. Stick around.
This is a Security Weekly production.
Welcome to Secure Digital Life. And you type in AAA porn or whatever it is you're typing in. I'm sorry. I was at a PG show.
And I'm really excited to be here.
I'm glad you're here because somebody needs to know what's going on.
That's right.
Okay. So
now somebody has to drink this.
It's another day. It's another episode.
Yeah, he's looking at the wrong camera.
Oh, you put my camera over here. Cut. Basically, forget you ever saw that. I think actually forgetting you ever saw that would really be a good idea at this point. Well, apparently Russ has been taken by the sand people or something, so he's not here. So I don't know where he is. He said he was sick, but, you know, there was a lot of screaming in the background or something like that, and I heard duct tape tearing. I don't know. I don't ask. It's just whatever, you know, consenting, non-consenting. I don't know. Today, we're going to start talking about Spectre and Meltdown and the AMD stuff that is a big problem in hardware architecture. And a lot of people had written and said, why haven't you talked about this? And I said, well, there's a lot of stuff to talk about before we can talk about that. Just like most things we do here, we're going to talk about all the different background pieces so that you understand what's actually going on. So today, we're actually talking about some computer science constructs, which sounds really, really exciting, but it actually is. And what is memory and how does all this stuff work? So we want to explain that because it's really hard to talk about Spectre and Meltdown if you don't really understand some basic things like buffer overflows, the stack overflows, and all this stuff that actually goes on. So the first question we have to ask is, what is memory anyway? I mean, memory is like the eternal sunshine of the spotless mind or something like that. Memory is a way that you store things, and everything uses memory, whether it's your brain and some kind of weird physical construct, which I don't understand. I mean, I'm ready to hack brains, but I really want to get, you know, like a good interface going, because right now the interface is just like, ugh. But memory in systems is really taking a physical thing and allocating it out into some kind of collection that you can organize, just like you would if you were doing it with sheets of paper. So, I mean, if I literally just took a whole bunch of sheets of paper and put them on this table, and I said, all these are the things I need to do for the show, somehow I have to organize them so that I can get back to them at a later point. And in memory and systems, we end up talking about that physical construct as being organized into what are called buffers. Sometimes, or pages, and there's different words for it, and we're not really talking about anything specific. So if you're saying, oh, well, that's not how that works in Apple or whatever, that's fine. Everybody does it their own way. We're really talking about it more in the context of you build it yourself. So if you're a computer science major, one of the assignments you might get at some point is to write an operating system or even write something lower level, depending on the program. So if you get more off into that electrical engineering EE world and less into the software world, you might actually sit down and say, how do we take all these chips which are on this board and access them in some kind of reasonable way? And you can't just say access them, because you actually have to access them in a way that you can remember. So you're kind of remembering memory, because so there's all these other pieces of memory, that it's not just about this one thing. So the operating system has to do all that. If we take all those sheets of paper and make little boxes out of them, I can come up with all kinds of different schemes by which I might be able to say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever. And then I always know that on page 0, which good computer science people always start counting at 0, because 0 is a person 2, and don't forget that. But I can start counting there and say all the way over to page whatever. And if I make a list, I can make an index, something you probably know how to do. Even if it was just on a little card, I can make another index that says on page 3 is where we find the formula for an arrow being shot through the air, because you want to refer to that. You know, I mean, how often do you need that? Every now? I mean, I've needed that before. Some of my students needed it too once, because I gave an assignment involving shooting arrows at a target, and it was unpopular. But in systems, whether it's a phone or it's a computer or a router or whatever it is, somehow memory has to be addressed. So we start off by saying we're going to block all this physical stuff into some kind of manageable form. So you could say, I'm going to block it into pages. And a page could be a certain amount. It could be 32 bytes. It could be 32K. It could be 32 gigs. It could be whatever you want to define it as, because it's yours. If you ever want to feel godlike and powerful, that's called being a system programmer, because you get to design it and make those pathetic loser users out there do your bidding. They have to because they have no choice, and their only option is to press help, which says call Doug, and he'll tell you why it's that way. Tough. And I've had developers who acted just like that. No, I mean, when you call them and said, why is this button here? It's a stupid place to put a button. They're like, because it's there and that's where it's going to be, and if you don't like it, use some other software, which I did, but regardless. So if we want to build out our memory like that, we then have some kind of addressing scheme that we've laid out in each one of these pages of memory. All right? Let's break that down further. So then you get to something called type def. And type def means basically, how am I going to use things in the system? Well, how much of this memory can something have? Can it have 8 bits? Can it have 8 bytes? Can it have 64 bytes? I don't know. That's what type def's all about. So type def in programming languages means that you're going to define things to have certain amounts of space allocated to them in the system. And that allows us to start setting up things. And if you've taken programming, and you probably have, and you started dealing with ints and floats and short ints and cars and all kinds of other things that you might, strings and all these things that are, you know, more or less easy to deal with, you've seen type defing going on whatever language you were fooling with. Because if you were sitting down and you say, I'm going to define something, well, we're building it ourselves, so we can build it any way we want. So if I take something and I call it a short, and again, don't get hung up on the terms, because I'm not referring to any specific language, and there's all these arguments we can get into, and we can get into slap fights with each other about why you should use short ints and how short ints are bad and all these kind of things. And we're not doing that. We're building it ourselves, so it could be anything at all. Now, our short can hold any number from 0 to F. And if you don't remember hex, we have a show about it, so go watch that show. But 0 to F, which means essentially that it's a 4-bit number. And a 4-bit number then could be anything from 0 to 15 in decimal, but 0 to F, we'll use hex. And so that means I've set up 4 bits of space on one of these pages. So I have all my pages laying here, and I take page 3, and I say, okay, I'm going to define a short. And short takes 4 bits, and that place it's going to be stored is on page 3. And that all is going on in the background whenever somebody writes a program, or you play a game, or you watch the show. Somebody decided where everything was going to go. And they do that by these types of addressing structures. So there's paging structures that are putting things in certain places in memory. There are type defs, which are putting things in the pages and saying, here's a block that's 4 bits long that starts at this point in page 3, and that's where you can get that value anytime you want to get it. Now, you might name that a variable and say, well, it's a variable name, so I'm going to call it foo or bar or x or y or whatever you want to call it, and we can name it so that it says something like x equals 12. And that 12 would then be stored in those 4 bits on page 3 at that offset from the beginning of page 3. So I could say this is 0 at the beginning of the page. I should have a page here, but I don't. At the beginning of the page is 0, and it runs all the way through whatever the end of the page is, depending on how big we decided that page was. And that offset determines where we start reading short. Now, this is important stuff. And I know it sounds kind of thick, but it really actually is pretty important, because as you want to start understanding hacking, you want to start understanding things that people do. One of the original hacks that people were doing way back when were buffer overflows. And that's where we want to get to be able to talk about in terms of what this stuff does. Another term that we have to bring up, this is like you're taking computer science 1 and 2 in like 15 minutes. The other piece of that is a linked list. And a linked list is a very fundamental computer science construct. I mean, if you don't know what a linked list is, you will, or you need to. Everybody should be forced to learn this, like learning the alphabet or something. You should learn how to do linked lists. But linked lists, because these pages of memory that we have laid out get messy, we may need a path to go through because maybe it doesn't all fit in one place. So we scatter things around. What if I've got a whole bunch of those shorts and I need to reference all of them in a tree or a database or a table or whatever? I may need not to store all 4 bits and 4 bits and 4 bits and 4 bits, but I may actually need to say 4 bits on page 3 and 4 bits on page 7 and 4 bits down here on page 3, and I got stuff scattered all over the place. I can even get into horrible situations, and this is, of course, bad design. Bad design is where you get into systems where have this horrible, fragmented, messy memory structures, and everything is scattered all around. And of course, when you do that, it starts to cause performance issues, it starts to cause problems, and then all of a sudden, you have a giant mess. We won't name any particular operating systems to get involved in. But a linked list, then, is a list of paths you could follow to get through a whole chain of things. And this is because not everything can be stored contiguously. And all these things end up relating to some of the hacks that we will eventually talk about. But I put some examples of this stuff in the show notes. One of the ones I was putting in was like a linked list where it's not stored contiguously, and you could make changes to it by putting letters, cars, which are 8-bit chunks, in pages, and then making a linked list through them to spell out the word a linked list. So you could put this little phrase by storing everything. And I put that in the show notes. So if you want to look at that, you can see that. Whenever I want to reassemble that list, I just follow the chain. So this first one points to the second one, which points to the third one, which points to the fourth one, and so on and so on and so on until there's some kind of terminator, which could just be the count. So I could make a linked list that starts at 0 and goes to 7, which would be 8 things, and it's always that big, so that's more of a type def. I could make a linked list that goes from 0 to some terminating character. And these are called delimiters. So maybe the delimiter is a semicolon in C. And if you read a linked list, it could be as big as you want it to be, but you eventually get to a point where you see a semicolon and you say, oh, that's the end of the linked list. So you follow that path all the way. Are you thinking of hacks already? I mean, this is where people started thinking about hacks initially, was how can I mess with these systems? And like I said, we'll talk about some of those things in a little bit in terms of how those things might change. Obviously, if I start realizing where these things are stored, all of a sudden I could make changes to those things on the fly. So I could change my linked list, and I think in the example I used in there, I put a K in one of the boxes, and now it spells a kinked list or something like that. And you can do that because it's very, very easy to manipulate linked lists if you know where things are stored because you have a map to it. And it says on page 3, offset whatever, if I make a change right there, the linked list changes. And all of a sudden, the whole thing changes. And in fact, as you start to swim in the sweet, warm waters of buffer overflows, what happens is you see people start making divergences from these lists. And instead of it pointing where it's supposed to point, it points over here to something else. And that starts to be the essence of some of the things that we're going to talk about on the next show when we talk about Spectre and Meltdown and all these kind of things. But for now, we're really just talking back again about basic buffer overflows. So I wanted to be sure you had some of that stuff in your backpack so you could talk about linked lists and you could talk about type defs, and we can use those terms and let them make sense. So let's talk then about what is a buffer overflow. I mean, can we talk? We need to explain this to each other. So down here at Programming Anonymous, we can all admit that we've written a buffer overflow or two. And this is one of the first things that beginning programming people usually sort of dive into in terms of causing harm. And today, most operating systems are fairly resilient to buffer overflows. But there was a time when that wasn't true. There was a time when a lot of operating systems were proprietary, meaning they had been written, just for that purpose. And they were often very flappy. I like that. Flappy is a cool word. They were kind of flappy in terms of how robust they were to respond to these things because people didn't really think about, why would someone do that? It makes no sense. And I'm going to bring up, as we get started talking about buffer overflows, the title of this episode is A Wolf in the Fold. And unfortunately, I don't have Russ here to monitor Facebook for me, but I was gonna give a prize and send a shirt or something to somebody that could tell me what that reference meant. But I'll just explain it. We'll do some prizes some other time. But A Wolf in the Fold was the name of an episode of Star Trek. I mean, imagine that. Programmers, Star Trek, Mr. Spock. And on the episode of Wolf in the Fold, poor old Majel Barrett was the computer. And I don't know if you knew that. That's a trivia question. Majel Barrett was Gene Roddenberry's wife. And she was the voice of all of the Enterprise computers, even on the other series. And she actually appeared in The Next Generation as Diana Troy's mom all the time. So just so you know, but poor old Majel, the computer, got infected with a piece of malware, which they described as a demon, which I don't think it was that kind of demon. You know, I when I first heard that, I was like, oh, a demon, like Daemon, you know, that kind of demon. And they were, I don't know, I think they mean an actual demon, you know, like Azazel or somebody who's like, But in the Wolf in the Fold episode, Spock exercises the demon, essentially by jumping in and asking poor old Majel to compute pi to the last digit. And somehow this essentially filled up all the memory on the system. Majel obviously was not very well written, so it worked. Otherwise, you know, I personally thought that was ridiculous because I was like, Spock would never do this. He would know this is, you know, yeah, okay, we won't get into that whole slap fight. But so one of the first things people start thinking about when they become programmers is it possible to simply overwhelm the system? And this is one of the sort of first hacking ideas that a lot of people sort of get to as well. So let's go back to our short for a second. So short, which we defined earlier, type def, is 4 bits long. That means that in 4 bits, 0000, I can write anything from 0000 to 1111, right? So that's 0, to F. 15 in decimal, 0 to 15. What if? So this is one of those first questions that a lot of people come up with is, what if in my application, I say something like foo equals 16? So I type def foo as a 4-bit number, and then I tell it it's equal to 16. Now, most modern programming languages are going to immediately go, hey, stupid. You know, type mismatch is the kind of error you get. So they'll say, this is a type mismatch. So if you ever got that error when you're writing code, that's usually what it means. Because the language, the compiler, is smart enough to go, hey, dummy, 16 doesn't fit in a 4-bit number. Use a different type. And you went back and said, oh, I see. Maybe then you used a different type. Or if you're writing it, you had to define a different type and put that in. But there have been cases where that very, very thing actually ended up resulting in a giant problem, which is a type of buffer overflow. And I know purists that buffer overflows are something else, but we're getting there. We're just trying to make sure everybody understands. There was a very famous case, very famous, of this exact thing, which was called the ping of death. No kidding. It was really called that. And it was awful. I was around because I'm old. This was way back when the internet first got going, and all of a sudden, all of our stuff started crashing that was connected to the internet, and no one knew why. The reason why was because people were taking the poor old hapless ping command, which has been around since the 70s, and they took the ping, and someone realized that you could set the size of the data payload. And the size of the data payload was fixed, type def, and somebody said, what if instead of this, I send that? And guess what happened? It started crashing people's networking equipment, and it was called the ping of death. And so this was a very early example of someone stuffing too many bits in too small of a space, and what happened essentially then was basically chaos. All those kind of overflows caused all sorts of chaos in different systems and applications since time immemorial, to the point of things like, I'm sorry, Dave, but obviously you're really stupid and have typed 16 in a space that only holds 15, so I'm just going to evacuate all the air in the Discovery and have a nice day as you die and you don't explode. That's a common mistake. But so basically, at the end of the day, that's the beginning of how an overflow could actually occur with just something just that simple. Now, let's go back to our linked list. If I take that linked list and I start doing things to that, I might actually have allocated a certain amount of space to my linked list. And if I allocated space to my linked list and I said, okay, here is how much space a linked list can have, or how much at least this one has, what if someone tacks another thing on the end of it? All of a sudden, it's a kind of buffer overflow, right? And it might actually make the linked list do something unusual. And again, that's these sort of very bad, people start learning this stuff in computer science or wherever you're learning it from, those guys down on the street corner who teach computer science, in their spare time and teach you the dark side. You start learning those kind of little weird things. So then we have one more concept we have to interject into this. And I know it was like, it's like computer science, help me, save me. But it's important stuff. And this is why security becomes a really complex thing for a lot of people, because you see all this background that's going into it. But I'm trying to explain it to you. Now, so let's go back to the programming for a second. When you have a programming language that is compilable, so this is your C's and things like that, as opposed to scripted like Python, you actually are allocating space with the compiler. So when you actually compile your program, it's allocating so much space out of these memory pages to that program. And it's doing that based on these type defs. So it takes them all, it adds them all up, and it assigns spots for everything. Now that whole thing becomes another kind of security problem, because when you start talking about, it always writes the password on page 3, offset 15. Guess what? People go, wow, I could just go to page 3, offset 15, pull that down into my application, and I know what your password was. Oops. And all of a sudden, you end up in this discussion about encryption or randomizing where things are saved and all this sort of stuff. But back in the program. So stack memory is memory that's allocated to a program as it's compiled. So that means as the compiler runs, it actually counts all this stuff up and says, here's how much we need. And it negotiates with the system for that. Heap memory is where I take memory on the fly. And so this ends up leading us to then one of the very basic, and we'll finish with this, one of the very basic initial computer science acts of mischief that people try to do. If somebody jumps in and they try to write a very basic computer program, and I put a couple of different examples in the show notes if you want to see, that are all in pseudocode. They're not written in any language, so we don't have to get in an argument about whose language is bigger. But basically, if I write a program that says x plus plus O2 go to O1, this is what's called an endless loop. And it keeps adding to x. If x is type def as, say, an 8-bit, so if I have an 8-bit type and x is that, if you don't remember from our other shows where we explained all that binary stuff, in 8 bits, the biggest thing you could write is 255. So this loop would iterate 256 times. It would start at 0, and it would hit 255. When it goes to 256, we've exceeded 8 bits. We've just gone into 9 bits. Oh, no. And once again, we're right back to that. Now we've overflowed the heap. And if we've done that, we could actually, if we do it correctly, we can, of course, try to suck up all the memory in the system. And what happens if you suck up all the memory in the system? I don't know. And that's what a lot of beginning hacker people started trying to find out. Now, again, as I said, today, in those operating systems, what people have done is they encapsulate things, they put it in shells, they put it in all kinds of different models to prevent you from doing just those kind of things. But if you were building it from scratch, you might not include those things. And if you didn't, well, basically what happens is, eventually you get back to a wolf in the fold. And that's what Mr. Spock did, was Mr. Spock created a kind of running heap allocation in poor old Majel. And, this show was on in the late 60s, so I'm guessing that the Enterprise's computer probably had something like, 64K of RAM. you know, I mean, the Federation spared no expense on sending people on those 5-year missions, so they probably went for the 64K model instead of the 32K model they were putting in all those lesser ships. But Spock went out there and allocated so much heap to calculating pi that essentially it took up the entire computer system. And because poor old Majel wasn't written very well, you know, she just basically kept allocating heap memory to it until they ran out. And of course, this somehow drove this, you know, supernatural spirit, which apparently was actually pretty powerless since it couldn't resist a simple little, you know, heap allocation, into the great unknown. But, you know, hey, it's TV, suspend disbelief and all that kind of stuff. Personally, I thought Spock should have slapped Kirk right about then, but, you know, that would have just made the episode for me. Picard would definitely have slapped Kirk or had Riker slap him or something like that. So I don't know. But all those things end up adding up to the idea of buffer overflows. And that was a lot. And there's even more in the show notes that you can go take a look at if you want to. And you should, because I really did go add a lot of stuff there. And we're going to keep talking about this in the next show. So I hope that next week you'll come back for more buffer overflows, stack overflows, and finally a discussion about Spectre, Meltdown, and the problem in AMD. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Secure Digital Life. Bye.